She was 20 years old, and she had $3 and a canteen to her name, and on the morning this story begins, she stood at the edge of a sea of sand and bought the right to dig into it. Her name was Josephine Hale, and the thing she bought was a claim on a stretch of drifting dunes in the desert of the New Mexico Territory. 100 square yards of blowing sand that no one had ever wanted and no one ever would, except that buried somewhere beneath it, 100 years gone, lay a locomotive. They called it the ghost engine of the Jornada. For that was the story of that country, told around every fire from the Rio Grande to the mountains, that 100 years before. In the days when the first railroad was being pushed across the desert, a locomotive had been lost in the sand. It had been a work engine, hauling rail and ties out to the end of the line, where the track was being laid across the great dry basin the old Spanish had named the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. And one night a sandstorm had come down out of the mountains such as the country had never seen, a storm that blew for 3 days and buried whole stretches of the new laid track under drifting dunes, and when it was over the work engine was gone. Simply gone. It had been standing on a siding at the railhead when the storm came, and when the storm cleared there was nothing there but a new range of dunes where the siding had been, and the locomotive was under them somewhere, buried whole, and the railroad, which had a line to finish and no time to dig, had laid new track around the drifts and gone on, and left the engine where it lay. And there it had stayed, 100 years under the shifting sand, and become a legend. The ghost engine. On some mornings, the old people said, when the wind had blown the dunes just so, you could see a black shape breaking the surface of the sand far out in the basin, the top of a smokestack or the curve of a boiler, there for an hour before the wind covered it again. Men had gone looking for it over the years, drawn by the story, but the dunes moved, and what showed one year was buried 30 feet deep the next, and the desert kept its engine, and after 100 years most people had come to doubt it had ever been real at all, and the ghost engine of the Jornada had passed into the kind of story that a country tells but no longer quite believes. Josephine Hale believed it. And more than that, she knew something about it that no one else alive knew. And it was that knowledge, and not the legend, that brought her out to the edge of the dunes with $3 to buy a claim on a patch of sand. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Hale, and the locomotive lost 100 years in the dunes, and the cab that was locked from the inside. And if a story of 100-year mystery and the patient courage to solve it is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. To understand what Josephine knew, you have to understand how she came to be alone in the world, and what her great-grandmother had left her. Josephine Hale had been raised by her great-grandmother, a fierce and ancient woman named Winifred Hale, who was past 90 when she died, and who had been, in her own girlhood, a witness to the very events that made the legend. For Winifred Hale had come to the Jornada country as a young bride 100 years before, and her own husband, Josephine's great-great-grandfather, a man named Daniel Hale, had been an engineer on the railroad in the days it was pushed across the desert, and Daniel Hale had been the engineer of the lost locomotive. He had been the man in the cab of the ghost engine on the night the storm came, and he had never come home. That was the family's grief, carried down 4 generations. Daniel Hale had died in the storm, the railroad said, buried with his engine under the sand, and his young wife Winifred had been left a widow with a child on the way, and she had lived a long, hard, bitter life, and had never remarried, and had never, in all her 90 years, stopped believing that there was more to her husband's death than the railroad had ever told. Josephine had grown up at the old woman's knee, and the story of Daniel Hale had been the great fact of her childhood, told so many times and with such fierce conviction that Josephine had come to feel she had known the young engineer herself, though he had died 80 years before she was born. Winifred Hale had been a hard old woman, made hard by a hard life. But when she spoke of her lost husband, something in her softened and burned at once, and Josephine had understood, young as she was, that the old woman had loved this man for 100 years, had kept faith with him across a whole century of widowhood, and had been sustained through all of it not by hope of his return, for she knew he was dead, but by a fierce refusal to let the lie stand that she was certain had been told about his death. "I was young," Winifred would say, her old hands gripping Josephine's, "and I had a baby coming, and no money and no power, and the railroad was the biggest thing in the world, and when they told me my Daniel was lost in the storm, and handed me a little money, and looked at me in that way that said, 'Be quiet, and be grateful,' I was quiet. God forgive me. I was quiet, but I never believed them. Girl, not for one day of 100 years. Something was wrong at that railhead, and my Daniel found it, and it killed him, and they buried it in the sand with him and called it weather." And Josephine had grown up with those words, and with the fierce old woman's grief, and had promised her, at the end, that she would go and find the truth, and had meant it, for the railroad had been quick, too quick, Winifred always said, to close the matter. It had paid her a small sum and called her husband lost in the storm and moved its track and its story on, and there had been things it would not answer, questions about that night that the railroad men turned away from, and Winifred Hale had gone to her grave 100 years later still certain that her young husband's death had been not merely a tragedy, but a thing someone had wanted buried, as surely as the sand had buried the engine. And she had left it all to Josephine. Not money, for there was none, but the story, the whole of it, told and retold through Josephine's childhood until she knew it as well as her own name, and one thing more. A small locked iron box, Daniel Hale's own, that had come home from the railhead among his few effects in the weeks after the storm. Before Winifred understood there were questions no one would answer. The box had been locked, and no key had ever come with it, and Winifred Hale had kept it locked and unopened for 100 years. Because it was her husband's, and she would not force it, and she had left it to Josephine, with the fierce old injunction that had been the last clear thing she said. "What your great-great-grandfather knew is in the sand with him. Girl, the railroad lied. Go and find the truth, if you have the courage I never had the means for." Josephine had opened the box, at last, after the old woman died. She had felt she had the right and the need. And inside it she had found the thing that sent her out to the dunes, not the answer, but the map to it. There were papers in the box, Daniel Hale's own, and among them a letter he had been writing to his wife in the last days before the storm, and never finished. And in that letter, in an engineer's plain hand, Daniel Hale had written that he had discovered something wrong at the railhead, something about the freight the work engine was hauling, something that the railroad's own men were doing in the dark that he did not understand, but did not like, and that he meant to gather the proof of it, and that he had begun to keep that proof safe, where no one would find it, in the strong box in the cab of his engine, to which he alone had the key. And then the letter broke off, unfinished, and 3 days later the storm came, and Daniel Hale and his engine and his strong box full of proof went under the sand together and were not seen again for 100 years. Josephine Hale understood, reading that unfinished letter, what her great-grandmother had never been able to prove. That Daniel Hale had died with a secret, and that the secret was in the cab of the buried engine, in a locked strongbox, under 100 years of sand. And she understood something else, something that turned the old grief into a thing she could act upon. The letter told her that Daniel Hale kept the cab of his engine locked, that he alone had the key, that it was his practice to secure the cab against the very men he had come to distrust. And the legend, the 100-year-old story of the ghost engine, had always carried one strange detail that no one had ever been able to explain. A detail Winifred had repeated 1,000 times, that in the days after the storm, before the dunes swallowed the engine entirely, one of the railroad's own search parties had reached it, had dug down to the cab, and had found the cab locked. Locked from the inside. And had been unable to open it, and had been driven off by the next storm, and had never gone back, and had let it be reburied. The cab of the ghost engine was locked from the inside, and no one had ever known why, and Daniel Hale's unfinished letter told Josephine the answer, because Daniel Hale had locked it himself, in the storm to keep his proof safe, and had died locked inside it with the truth. She went out to the dunes with $3 and bought her claim. A patch of sand the county sold her gladly for the filing fee, thinking her mad, and she set out to do the thing 4 generations of her family had been unable to do, to dig the ghost engine out of the sand, and open the cab that had been locked for 100 years, and bring up the truth her great-great-grandfather had died to keep. The finding of it came first, and that was a labor of its own, for the dunes moved, and the engine that showed 1 year was buried deep the next. But Josephine Hale had an advantage that the treasure hunters of 100 years had not. She had Daniel Hale's own papers, and among them the working notes of the railhead, and from those she could reckon, better than any legend chaser, roughly where the siding had stood on the night of the storm. And she had studied the dunes. She spent her first weeks not digging but watching, camped at the edge of the sand learning how the dunes moved, which way the wind drove them, where the old buried land lay lowest beneath them, and she reasoned, as her engineer great-great-grandfather might have, that a heavy iron locomotive would have settled to the old hard ground beneath the sand and stayed there while the dunes marched over it, and that the place to dig was not where the sand was highest, but where the buried old ground lay, along the vanished line of the railbed she had plotted from the notes. It was patient, unglamorous work, that watching, and anyone passing would have thought her idle or mad, a young woman sitting day after day at the edge of a sea of sand, doing nothing but looking. But she was not idle. She was learning the desert the way her great-great-grandfather had learned his engines, from the outside in, until she understood its habits and could predict its moods. She marked the dunes with stakes and watched how far they marched in a week. She learned the prevailing wind and the way the sand piled deep on one face of a dune and lay thin on the other. She walked her plotted line of the vanished railbed again and again, at dawn and at dusk, when the low light threw every ripple of the sand into relief, watching for the one thing she knew the desert would eventually show her, if she was only patient enough to be looking on the morning it did. And on a morning after a hard wind, walking her plotted line, she saw it, a black shape breaking the surface of the sand, far out where her reckoning said the siding had stood, there for an hour in the low light before the wind should cover it again, the top of a smokestack. The ghost engine showing itself exactly where 100-year-old engineer's own notes had said it would be. Josephine Hale stood and looked at it a long while, that black shape in the sand that 4 generations of her family had wept over and that she had crossed her whole young life to find, and then she drove a stake to mark the place and went to fetch her tools. For the finding was done, and the digging was to begin. The digging was the work of a whole autumn, and Josephine did most of it alone, and it was labor such as few could have endured. For digging in sand is not like digging in earth. The sand runs. It fills the hole behind you. It slides and shifts and buries what you have uncovered. And to dig down 30 feet to a buried engine through dry running sand is to fight a thing that undoes your work as fast as you do it. The first days nearly broke her. Before she understood the enemy, she dug straight down, as anyone would, a good deep shaft toward the buried cab, and she came out in the evening satisfied with her depth, and in the morning the shaft was gone, run full of sand in the night as though she had never dug at all, the desert having quietly undone a whole day's labor while she slept. She wept, that first morning, standing over the vanished hole, and then she dried her eyes and sat down and thought, the way her great-great-grandfather the engineer would have thought, about the nature of the thing that beat her. Sand was not earth. Earth held the shape you cut in it. Sand sought always to lie at its own gentle angle and would run and slump until it found it. You could not fight that. You could only work with it. So Josephine learned the way of it slowly and hard. She could not simply dig a hole, the sand ran back in. She had to dig a great wide sloping pit. Far wider at the top than the engine was deep, its sides angled gently to the very slope the sand wished to lie at, so that the sand would lie still and not run, and she had to move 10 times the sand she would have moved in a mere shaft, hauling it up and out and far away on a sledge she built from her shoring boards. She had to shore the working face with boards and brush hauled miles out into the dunes, for there was no wood in that sea of sand, and every stick had to be carried in on her back. She had to dig in the cool of the mornings and shelter through the killing heat of the days, and haul the sand far enough that the wind would not simply blow it back into her pit, and she had to do it all over again each time a wind came in the night and half filled her work, and there were weeks when she despaired, when a single storm undid a month of labor, when it seemed the desert would defend its engine against her as it had against everyone for 100 years. But Josephine Hale had her great-grandmother's fierceness and her great-great-grandfather's patient engineering mind, and she did not quit. She learned to work with the sand instead of against it, to let the angles of repose do her shoring for her, to time her digging to the calm spells between winds, to read the sky for the coming of a blow and shelter her pit before it came. She built brush fences upwind of her work, low barriers of hauled mesquite that turned the drifting sand aside, and made a pocket of still air where her pit could stand, the way her great-great-grandfather's own railhead notes had described the snow fences of the northern lines, for the principle was the same, and she had his mind for such things in her blood. And across the autumn, foot by foot, the great buried engine came up out of the sand under her hands. First the smokestack, then the boiler, black and sand scoured but whole. Then the great driving wheels taller than she stood. Then the long iron flank of the thing, and at last, deep at the bottom of her wide pit, 30 feet down, where the old hard ground lay, the cab. The cab of the ghost engine, iron-walled, its windows sanded blind, its door shut, and when Josephine climbed down to it at last and tried the door, it held. Locked from the inside, as it had been for 100 years, as it had been since the night Daniel Hale locked himself in with the truth and the storm took him. Josephine Hale stood at the bottom of her pit before the locked cab of her great-great-grandfather's engine, and she understood that she had come to the last door, and that opening it meant facing what was inside, which was not only the truth but the man, the young engineer dead 100 years, sealed in his iron cab with his proof. She was not afraid, or not only afraid, she felt, more than fear, a kind of solemn tenderness, for she had come across 100 years and 4 generations to open a door her family had wept before, and she meant to open it gently. She did not force it. She found, as the railroad search party 100 years before had found, that the door could not be forced from without, for Daniel Hale had barred it well. But Josephine had what that search party had not: time and care, and no storm at her back driving her to give up. She worked at the sanded shut window of the cab instead, the smaller barrier, easing away the century of packed sand grain by grain, prying loose the sand-cemented frame with the patience she had learned from the dunes themselves, and through it at last she came into the cab of the ghost engine, into the sealed iron chamber that had held its secret for 100 years. Daniel Hale was there, what the dry sand had left of him, which was more than the years alone would have, for the sand had sealed the cab airtight and dry, and preserved within it a still, sad tableau 100 years old. He was at his post, or near it, as though he had stayed with his engine to the last, and the sight of him stopped Josephine where she stood, half in and half out of the window she had opened, for she was looking at last upon the man who had been the great fact of her whole childhood, the young husband her great-grandmother had loved and mourned for 100 years, and he was no legend now, no story told at a fierce old woman's knee, but a real man who had been young and afraid and brave, sealed in this iron room in the dark of a storm with the proof he had died to keep. She climbed the rest of the way in, slowly, and stood in the cab with him in the dim sand-filtered light, and she did not feel horror, though perhaps she should have, but only a great and breaking tenderness, and she said aloud to the man dead 100 years that she had come, that Winifred had sent her, that they knew he had not simply been careless in a storm, that his family had never stopped believing in him, and that she had come to bring the truth up into the light at last. And it seemed to her, in the deep hush of that sealed iron room, that the long grief of 4 generations of Hale women reached its end in that moment, in the meeting of the great-great-granddaughter and the young engineer across the 100 years that had parted them, and with him, just as his unfinished letter had promised, locked in the strongbox that he alone had held the key to, was the proof he had died to keep. Josephine found the key on him, where he had kept it to the end, and she opened the strongbox with her great-great-grandfather's own key, and she brought out into the light the truth that had lain 100 years in the sand. It was a packet of documents, papers Daniel Hale had gathered and hidden in his last days, and as Josephine read them, there at the bottom of her pit in the desert light, she understood at last the thing her great-grandmother had believed to her grave, that the railroad had lied, and that Daniel Hale had not simply died in a storm, but had died because of what he had found. For Daniel Hale had discovered a crime. The work engine he drove had been hauling more than rail and ties out to the railhead. Under the direction of certain of the railroad's own officers, it had been used to haul away, in secret at night, a fortune in gold and supplies that those officers were stealing from the railroad's own stores and shipments. Diverting the wealth meant to build the line into their own pockets, and covering the theft in the railroad's vast and chaotic accounts. Daniel Hale, an honest engineer, had stumbled onto it, had seen what was being loaded and unloaded in the dark, and had begun, quietly, to gather the proof, the false manifests, the doctored waybills, the records that showed where the stolen wealth was going and whose hands were dirty. He had hidden it in his strongbox, and he had meant to bring it to the authorities, and the thieving officers had come to suspect him. And the storm, Josephine understood with a cold certainty as she read the last of the papers, had been their chance, or perhaps had been more than chance. For the last document was a page in Daniel Hale's own hand, written, it seemed, in the very cab, in the dark of the storm's first night, a final desperate note, that he knew now they meant to be rid of him, that the storm had given them cover, that he had heard them uncouple his engine on the siding and had barred himself in the cab with the proof, meaning to wait out the storm and carry the truth to safety. He had not known that the storm would bury him. He had locked himself in to keep the thieves out, and the sand had come, and the men who wanted him dead had not even had to lift a hand. The desert had done their work and buried the honest engineer and his proof together, and the thieving officers had let the story of a tragic accident stand, and had gone on, rich and unpunished, and had watched the sand close over the one thing that could ever hang them. 100 years too late, Josephine Hale brought it up into the light. She carried the papers out of the desert, and she did not take them to the railroad, whose own long-dead officers they condemned, but to the authorities of the state and the descendants of the railroad's honest founders, and she laid before them the whole 100-year-old crime, the theft, the murder by abandonment of an honest engineer, the lie that had covered it. And though the men who had done it were 100 years dead and beyond any earthly justice, the truth of it mattered still, for the crime had never been closed and the stolen wealth had never been accounted, and the descendants of the thieving officers had risen, on their stolen start, to be families of wealth and standing in the territory, their fortunes founded on gold stolen from the building of the railroad and on the death of the man who had tried to stop them. The truth came out, all of it, and it did what truth does. The families whose fortunes were shown to be founded on the old theft did not lose everything, for the law is a blunt instrument across 100 years, but they lost the thing they had bought most dearly, which was the lie of their own respectability, and the name of Daniel Hale, which the railroad had let lie for a century as merely one more man lost to the desert, was raised up at last and honored for what it truly was, the name of an honest man who had died to expose a crime, and had kept his proof faithfully in an iron box under the sand for 100 years until his own blood came to bring it to the light. And Josephine Hale was not left with nothing, for honesty in these stories is rewarded, though she had not gone into the dunes for reward. The railroad's honest heirs and the state together saw that the woman who had solved a 100-year-old crime and recovered a fortune's worth of records was given a substantial reward. And there was, moreover, a portion of the old stolen wealth that could still be traced and recovered, and a share of it came to Josephine as the heir of the man who had died to expose the theft. She was not poor anymore. But the thing she valued most was not the money. It was that she had given her great-grandmother's fierce 100-year belief its vindication at last, and her great-great-grandfather his honor, and had closed, with her own hands, the grief that 4 generations of Hale women had carried. She saw Daniel Hale buried at last, properly, beside the wife who had waited for him 100 years, old Winifred, so that the young engineer lost in the storm and the fierce widow who never stopped believing in him lay together at the end, their long separation closed. And she kept the ghost engine. She had it dug fully out and drawn up out of the sand, the great lost locomotive of the Jornada, and she saw it restored and set up as a monument, with the true story told upon it, so that the legend that a country had told for 100 years and half stopped believing became, at last, a true history, the story of the honest engineer and the crime he died to expose, and the great-great-granddaughter who dug his engine out of the sand and opened the cab he had locked from the inside and brought up the truth at last. She had been 20 years old, and orphaned, and alone with $3 in a canteen, and she had spent it all on a patch of drifting sand that a whole country swore held nothing but a ghost story. It was the best $3 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the recovered gold, for the gold was the least of it. It is that some truths are buried so deep and for so long that the people who buried them come to believe they are safe forever, and that the desert of years will keep their secret as surely as it kept the engine. But nothing is buried forever. The sand shifts. The dunes move. The wind blows just so on some far morning, and a black shape breaks the surface, and a person comes at last with the patience to dig, and the truth that lay 100 years in the dark comes up again into the light, as whole and as damning as the day it was buried. The thieves of the Jornada died, believing the sand had saved them. It had only kept the evidence dry for 100 years, and waited, as patient as the truth always is, for the one who would come to dig it out. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Is there a truth in your own family's past, or your country's, that someone once believed they had buried forever, that has waited a long time in the dark for the patient hands that would bring it up into the light? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.